snow drifted across the Montana highlands like a ghostly veil. In January 1877, the area was seized by the iron grip. Bitter cold gnawed at flesh and bone, and breath hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Two forces, one under the command of General Nelson A. Miles, and the other under the leadership of the unwavering Lakota warrior Crazy Horse, faced off in this frigid silence. What followed would come to be known as the Battle of Wolf Mountain, one of the last great engagements of the Indian Wars, fought not just with bullets and bayonets, but against the cruel fury of nature itself. Miles, a hard-driving officer with a jaw like carved stone and a will to match, had already earned a fierce reputation for his relentless campaigns across the northern plains. He was a man who understood that winter was as much a weapon as it was an obstacle. In the dead of winter, soldiers could march on frozen ground, rivers could be crossed without bridges, and native encampments, weary and undersupplied, could be caught off guard. It was a grim kind of logic, but Miles was a student of war, and the frontier had taught him that mercy was rarely a two-way street. Crazy Horse, by contrast, had never sought war for glory. Born in the land of the bison and raised with the rhythms of the plains, he was a quiet, mysterious figure who fought because he had no other choice. The treaties had been broken, the bison herds slaughtered, and the Lakota way of life was under siege. Less than a year earlier, Crazy Horse had dealt Custer and his 7th Cavalry a crushing blow at the Little Bighorn. But the tide was turning. The U.S. Army had responded with overwhelming force, and the great bands of the northern plains were beginning to scatter. By early January 1877, Crazy Horse's band had taken refuge at the Tongue River, near the snow-capped peak of Wolf Mountain, exhausted, hungry, and cold from the relentless chase. He wasn't looking for a fight. Not then. But Miles was closing in fast, and the ground was hard, frozen, and unforgiving. On January 7th, 1877, Miles reached the bluffs above the river with a force of about 436 men, infantry, cavalry, and Indian scouts. They were poorly dressed for the weather, wrapped in buffalo hides and thick wool, their breath steaming through frostbitten mustaches. There was little visibility and a heavy fall of snow, the kind that slices sideways in the wind. But Miles had no intention of turning back. The Lakota had to be broken, and winter would help him do it. Below them, Crazy Horse's encampment stirred with alarm. It was not a war camp. Many families had gathered there, women, elders, children. There were no walls, no fortifications, just the will to survive another day. But the Lakota had been tested before. Crazy Horse and his warriors rose quickly, gathering what rifles they had and riding out to meet the soldiers on the high ground. What followed was not a sweeping cavalry charge or a dramatic last stand. It was something colder, grittier, a gunfight in the snow, fought over steep bluffs, icy ravines, and wind-blasted plains. The first shots rang out as Lakota warriors climbed the ridges to challenge the soldiers. Miles had placed his men on the high ground, a calculated move that gave him both visibility and range. But the weather fought them every step of the way. Rifles misfired, boots cracked in the cold, fingers turned numb on the trigger, and yet both sides pushed forward. Crazy Horse launched a series of bold flanking maneuvers, trying to cut into the soldiers' lines. His riders darted through the snow like ghosts, here and gone in a blink, using the terrain to their advantage. Some even made it close enough to force hand-to-hand fighting. But Miles held firm. Cannon fire roared through the snowstorm, tearing gashes into the earth and sending up clouds of white powder. The wind howled so fiercely that scouts later said it was hard to hear a man next to you yelling. And yet they fought on, two cultures colliding on a field of frozen silence. Although the struggle was brief, not measured in hours, it was difficult. For 4 brutal hours, the snow soaked in blood, horses collapsed from exhaustion and men fell, some never to rise again. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it slowed. When Crazy Horse realized the odds and the danger to his people, he started to reduce the size of his army. He hadn't been routed, far from it. He had tested Miles, hit his lines, and showed once again why his name struck fear into the hearts of seasoned commanders. But he also saw the writing in the snow. The U.S. Army would not stop. and with the families of his people exposed to the cruel teeth of winter, he chose survival over slaughter. Miles, bloodied but unbroken, claimed the field. His men dug in that night beneath a sky streaked with clouds, the firelight flickering across frostbitten faces. It was a hollow sort of victory. The Lakota hadn't been destroyed, but they were fading into the snowdrifts, deeper into the hills, farther from the reach of safety. Although the conflict did not drastically change as a result of the Battle of Wolf Mountain, it did change in spirit. It showed that even Crazy Horse, the great tactician and fearless warrior, was running out of options. Within a few months, the war bands that had once ridden proud and defiant across the plains were surrendering, one by one. The bison were gone. The ammunition was low. The dream of freedom was growing dim. General Crook wasn't there when Crazy Horse finally laid down his arms at the Red Cloud Agency on the 5th. Instead, Lieutenant W.P. Clark of the 2nd Cavalry stood in for him. Clark had been handling affairs with the Sioux at both Red Cloud and Spotted Tail agencies for the last 5 months, and by all accounts, he managed the tribes with remarkable skill and diplomacy. Major Randall and Lieutenant Bourke were also on hand, representing the commanding officer of the department. The formal act of surrender wasn't a grand ceremony, but it had the weight of history behind it. It was distinguished by an in-person encounter between Crazy Horse and Lieutenant Clark. The Lakota leader rode in with a hand-picked escort of 300 warriors, all decked out in their most striking gear: bright colors, war paint, feathers, and finely decorated weapons, evoking the kind of fierce pageantry you'd expect from medieval knights rather than plains warriors. Watching from nearby ridges were another 200 mounted braves, silent and alert, ready for anything. Walking close beside Crazy Horse were several of his top men: Little Wolf, He-Dog, and Little Big Man, his inner circle. Few others were allowed near him, and even fewer dared speak to him casually. That sense of distance, that commanding presence, set Crazy Horse apart from every other native leader folks had encountered. He kept himself above the crowd, and because of it, his people both feared and deeply respected him. Crazy Horse was about 38 years old then, tall, well-built, and proud. He looked much like other strong, intelligent Sioux warriors, but there was something in his bearing, something quiet and dignified, that made him stand out. His eyes were constantly moving, sharp and restless, giving him an intense air that could make even the toughest frontiersman uneasy. A bullet wound scarred his left cheek, a mark he got during a personal quarrel years earlier, the story goes, and it's that same feud that first made his name known far and wide. The injury pulled one side of his mouth into a tight, harsh line, giving his face a slightly wild, hardened expression. And yet, beneath that scar, there was something deeper. Something that told you this man had carried a people through years of resistance, and now, finally, was stepping into a moment that would mark the end of an era. Crazy Horse walked forward all by himself to meet Lieutenant Clark. After covering a short distance, he sat down quietly on the ground and waited. Clark, respecting the gesture, did the same. After a moment, Crazy Horse stood, walked slowly the remaining few steps between them, and extended his hand. They shook, but not a single word passed from the warrior's lips. A council followed, with Red Cloud speaking on Crazy Horse's behalf. The famed war leader remained silent throughout, staying true to his reserved and enigmatic nature. Red Cloud made it clear that Crazy Horse and his warriors hadn't been beaten in the field, nor had they surrendered out of fear. Rather, this was a choice, one made for the sake of his people. And just as they had followed him in war, they would follow him now into peace, trusting his judgment without question. Between 1,000 and 1,500 Sioux men, women, and children came in with him that day, including about 500 seasoned warriors. Along with them came 2,200 ponies, all in strong shape and ready for hard travel if needed. They turned in 147 firearms. Many were high-quality sporting rifles and .45 caliber Springfield carbines, the very same used by the U.S. Army. Still, there was no illusion that this was all they had. It was widely believed that most of their weapons had been carefully hidden away, stashed in remote spots known only to the Sioux. Should the day ever come when they were needed again, those guns would be ready. Crazy Horse hadn't set foot near a government agency in over a dozen years. His last visit to any outpost was right here. Now that he had returned, his proud and almost scornful demeanor didn't sit well with Colonel Mackenzie. The colonel, still bitter over the brutal fate of Custer and his men, had little patience for what he saw as a peaceful welcome for the man many blamed for that massacre. Mackenzie made no effort to hide his feelings. In his eyes, Crazy Horse deserved time in the guardhouse at Camp Robinson, and maybe a stint hauling water for the post, just to bring him down a peg. Even nearby Indian villages, including those of the Arapaho and Cheyenne, were keeping their distance. They'd quietly packed up and moved farther away, unsettled by Crazy Horse's unpredictable nature and brooding silence. The Cheyenne, especially, had endured the hardest of the fighting. By the time they reached the agency, they were worn out, ragged, and nearly starving. They spoke plainly. Whatever fire they once had for battle had burned out. They had permanently ended the war. Few stories better convey the Indian way of thinking than this one. When word got out that Crazy Horse was heading toward the agency to surrender, Lieutenant J. Wesley Rosenquist of the 4th Cavalry was dispatched with an escort and a supply train loaded down with government rations to meet him on the trail. The Sioux welcomed him like old friends, especially the food. Many of them hadn't tasted anything like Uncle Sam's sugar, tea, or hardtack in a long while, and their hunger spoke louder than any orders. They pitched camp right then and there and refused to go any farther. That night and all through the next day, they ate like they hadn't in weeks, non-stop, until every scrap of those rations was gone. Even after they'd eaten their fill, they still wouldn't budge. For 2 more days, despite the lieutenant's growing frustration, they lounged about, too full and sluggish to travel. At last, they slowly packed up and resumed the journey. But just as they neared the agency, a sudden commotion broke out. A few young warriors scouting ahead spotted a large herd of antelope and opened fire. The sound of gunshots, echoing across the plains, sent panic through the main camp. Fearing an ambush by soldiers, the entire group, women, children, dogs, ponies, the whole lot, panicked and stampeded into the nearby bluffs for cover. It took a good while before order was restored and the scattered people were brought back together. Among the crowd were quite a few strikingly beautiful women, faces marked by both hardship and pride, just like the land they called home.